All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Like I said, my name is Miguel Lozada. I'm the current president of Puerto Rico Lacrosse, and I am honored and blessed to be here with you this evening for our second installment of our cultural webinar, led by Dr. Ismael Carreras, who's been with the organization for quite some time. We usually have. Sorry, if you're on the call, try to mute yourself unless you have a question later on. But as I was saying, as a staff, Puerto Rico Lacrosse, we were kind of come up with ways to engage our audience, engage our family, and we thought this was the best way to, one, learn about our history, learn about our culture, and kind of get everyone involved with the organization in a unique way. So with that being said, if you have any questions regarding the presentation, put them in the group chat, and we'll do a little Q&A at the end so that we can address them and just kind of get some dialogue and create an open space for everyone to talk about their thoughts on what's going on. So without further ado, I'll give the microphone on the stage to Ismael.
Thank you, Miguel. Can everybody see the slides? Are they showing up, Miguel?
Yes, I see them. They should be good.
All right, perfect. Excellent. Okay, mi gente, good evening. So tonight we're going to continue our series with Capítulo 2, Chapter 2. So Chapter 1 was rather personal, talking about a collective experience through my story. This session is going to be a bit more factual. Here we have our image of our Flor de Maga, which is our national flower. In English, we would sometimes refer to this as a hibiscus, but recognize that there are literally hundreds of species of hibiscus around the world. But this was the flower that Jasmine Camacho Quinn wore in her hair while on the podium at the Olympics last summer. So some of you may know that Curb Your Enthusiasm is my favorite show. My wife and I absolutely love Larry David and his humor. I know he drives some people nuts and they can't stand him, but I love him. There's a scene in season 2 where Larry and his wife Cheryl are on a long drive, and he's being super annoying, and he's going on, giving his opinions on various random topics. And in one of his rants, he goes on about how Alaska and Hawaii shouldn't have been admitted as states because we didn't need anything beyond the continental US, and that we didn't need to become like the British Empire. And then he finishes his tirade with, and what is Puerto Rico anyway? So going back to our Sesame Street days, the number of the day is 54. In the immediate aftermath, after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, the New York Times commissioned a national poll by the firm Morning Consult. In that poll, only 54% of Americans knew that Puerto Ricans were US citizens. That means that nearly half of Americans couldn't say definitively that Puerto Ricans were US citizens. Either they answered no, they weren't citizens, or they weren't sure if they were citizens. Now, what's also interesting around these data, now, just as an aside, I'm a data guy. What's interesting about this data is that you can see that when you drill down a little bit more deeply, there's an age effect. When you look at these results for older Americans, say those age 65, the percentage of those responding yes increased to 64%. But for young Americans, those age 18 to 29, the percentage dropped to just 37% who said yes, Puerto Ricans are US citizens. So the younger Americans are not being taught about basic US geography, which probably says something about the current state of the US public education system. So with that as our backdrop, Larry David and this Morning Consult poll, let's quickly review some of the basics about Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. So we are a US territory and have been so since 1898. So we're US citizens and can freely travel, live, and work between Puerto Rico and anywhere in the United States, including the other territories. Now, people often refer to Puerto Rico as an island, but we're actually an archipelago of 143 islands. 3 of them are permanently inhabited by people: the main island of Puerto Rico, plus Vieques and Culebra. We cannot forget about our brothers and sisters who live in Vieques and Culebra. Nearly 9 million of us worldwide, a little over 3 million in Puerto Rico, and over 5 million in the diaspora, mostly in the United States, but we're literally everywhere. Spanish and English are official languages. Spanish is the predominant language in Puerto Rico. If you stay in the San Juan area and along the coast, you can probably get by speaking only English. But as you move into the more rural areas in the interior, it will get harder to find people who know English very well. Now, incidentally, the sole English-only place in Puerto Rico is in the U.S. Federal Courthouse in San Juan. We do have our own international sports teams and federations. We've done so since the 1930s, when we began participating as a nation in the Central American and Caribbean Games. And we are a multiracial society. Most of us descend from people of European, African, and indigenous origins, but we literally have people from all over the world, including communities from the Middle East and Asia, who are making Puerto Rico their home. So just for completeness, I do have a map showing where on the planet Puerto Rico is. It's the star just to the east of the Dominican Republic and Caribbean. And on the map, you can see the main island of Puerto Rico here. You have the island of the longish blue island here is Vieques, and then the smaller blue one here is Culebra. This blue island here is Isla de Mona. That's not inhabited. And then the green here are the US Virgin Islands, and the white is the British Virgin Islands. From all up and down the East Coast, Puerto Rico is located about a 3 or 4 hour flight, including Boston, which we call the hub of the universe. Need I say more? So let's take a look at Puerto Rico in just a little more detail. You will sometimes see references to 100 by 35 for our island, and what they're talking about is the approximate mileage, length times width for the main island of Puerto Rico. Those dimensions put it a little over half the size of Connecticut. So you can see up here, the main metropolitan area, the capital region, is here in the Northeast. This includes the community, the cities of San Juan, Carolina, Bayamón, Guaynabo is in there as well. The other major cities, you have Caguas here and more in the interior, Ponce in the south, Mayagüez in the west. Now, once you leave the coast, we think of a lot of people have this image of Puerto Rico as being sort of, you know, a beach, tropical, flat paradise. But once you get away from the coast, Puerto Rico is actually very mountainous. The Cordillera Central, which is this main mountain range that runs all the way from west to east to the center of the island, it's very mountainous. Some of the peaks go to about 4,000 feet. And then you have a little valley here, the Caguas Valley, and then you get another mountain sort of range here, which is the Sierra de Luquillo. And it's over here where the El Yunque, which is our tropical rainforest and is the only tropical it's the only US national park that is a tropical rainforest. So that's pretty unique. In a lot of places, though, you know, it's not so easy to get to from certain points in Puerto Rico. You know, to get to from San Juan to Ponce, you basically, there's just a single main road here through Caguas, and then down the valley here through Salinas, and then head west to Ponce. This part of the island, Ponce, the southwest part of the island, is much drier than over here in the north and east, where the rainforest is. All right, I want to give you a very quick one-page history of Puerto Rico. And first, we have to start with the time before the arrival of the Europeans. The Taíno, which are the indigenous people, lived in the archipelago for centuries, and they called the main island Boriquen or Borinquen, which means the land of our valiant and noble Lord. And that's why we call ourselves Boricuas. We're saying that we come from Boriquen in honor of our indigenous ancestors. Now, in 1493, the Europeans arrive with Columbus's second voyage. The Spanish arrive on Boriquen, which ushered over 400 years of colonial rule over Puerto Rico. In 1868 marked the Grito de Lares, or the Lares Uprising, and this was the first major revolt against Spanish rule by the local free population, who were pushing for autonomy from Spain and also pushing for the end of slavery on the island. Now, there had been several revolts by indigenous and enslaved people beforehand, but this is truly the first sort of revolt for independence among the free people. It lasted one day before it was put down by the Spanish. And Lares today is known as the birthplace of Puerto Rican nationalism. And that is the sense for the first time that we are a distinct people separate from Spain. Now, in 1897, Spain granted a limited form of autonomy to the people of Puerto Rico, which served as a path towards independence. And in February of 1898, the new government was installed. Elections for the bicameral legislature took place in March, and that legislature was inaugurated on the 17th of July of 1898. However, the US, through its involvement in the Spanish-American War, invaded Puerto Rico on July 28th, 1898, so just 11 days later. And at the conclusion of the war, took possession of Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam. Puerto Ricans would have to wait until 1917 before they were granted citizenship by US Congress under the Jones-Shayforth Act. And I'll say more about that in a second. And then in 1952, Puerto Rico becomes a commonwealth with its own constitution, led by Luis Muñoz Marin, the first freely elected governor of Puerto Rico. And this gave Puerto Rico the ability to govern its own administrative and legislative affairs, but it still gave the US Congress responsibility for key aspects of Puerto Rican society, including citizenship and currency, the postal service, foreign policy, military defense, commerce, and finance. So one question that I hear sometimes is about Puerto Rican citizenship. And this has come up in the context of understanding who is eligible to play for Team Puerto Rico. Now, as you know, Puerto Ricans are US citizens at birth. We do not issue our own passports. We use US passports as citizens of the US. And this is the same situation as athletes who represent England, Scotland, and Wales. They have UK citizenship and passports. I'm going to set aside Northern Ireland for a second. That one's more complicated. But what you may not know is that as a territory, the Puerto Rican citizenship or Puerto Rican rights to US citizenship is not, those rights are not guaranteed by the US Constitution. The Foraker Act of 1900 established that Puerto Ricans were US nationals and thus could live and work in the US, but that wasn't full citizenship. That would have to wait until the Jones-Shayforth Act of 1917. And if Congress ever wanted to take that away, they could. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think Congress is kind of distracted with other affairs. So this idea about Puerto Rican citizenship, it actually exists, but as only a legal construct. This was actually established by the Puerto Rico Supreme Court in the Juan Mari Bras case. Juan Mari Bras was a Puerto Rican activist who in 1994 went to a US consulate in Venezuela to renounce his US citizenship to live in Puerto Rico only as a Puerto Rican citizen. That created a lot of legal confusion for the next 10 years because the US State Department originally accepted his revocation of his citizenship, but then lawsuits came up that forced it to reinstate its citizenship decision because of some of the things that Juan Mari Bras was trying to do in Puerto Rico, that is, to vote. The net result of all this is that in 2006, the Puerto Rico Department of State began issuing its own citizenship document, and Juan Maribras received the very first one, like what you see here on the screen. So if you were born in Puerto Rico or are a US citizen with a parent who was born in Puerto Rico or have established residency in Puerto Rico, you can claim Puerto Rican citizenship. So you can see mine here. It was a bit of an ordeal to obtain, but if there's some time at the end of the session, we can talk a little bit more about how to obtain that. Because there's just a couple of nuances that make this a little bit of a challenge. Now, this document is largely symbolic. You can't travel with it. However, some of the Act 20 or 2260 transplants from the US are being encouraged to get this document as a way to more easily demonstrate their Puerto Rican citizenship to take advantage of those tax laws in Puerto Rico. Now, the one place that this document actually does have legal recognition is in Spain. And that's important for those people who might want to become citizens of that country, which if you're a citizen of Spain, it also gives you citizenship to the EU member states as well. Now, normally immigrants who reside in Spain must wait for 10 years to get citizenship. However, if you're a resident and have citizenship from either Portugal, Andorra, or the former colonies and territories of Spain, including the Philippines and all of Latin America, you fall into a special expedited classification where the wait for Spanish citizenship is only 2 years. And they've established that Puerto Ricans who have this document fall into that special expedited classification. So it's more than just a show document. It actually has some legal weight in some important ways. So I was asked at the last presentation to know a little bit more about our history and important historical figures that Puerto Ricans must know. And I'm not talking about J-Lo, I'm not talking about Bad Bunny or Ricky Martin or even Sonia Sotomayor, because we all know them. I'm talking about important historical figures who are important to our people, who are talked about in the schools. And so I structured this as an all-time starting lineup of 10 players representing the various positions of the lacrosse field. In the international women's game, we play with 10, so that aligns really nicely with the men's game. So these are the 10 that I've deemed very important for us to know. So let's go. All right, so we're going to start off in goal. And goal is the toughest position in lacrosse. It requires someone who's crazy and brave enough to take on what is an impossible task. So for our team, we have to go way back in time to the person they called El Bravo, the brave one. That person is Aguaybana Segundo, the second. He was the Taino chieftain who came from what is present-day Guayama on the south coast, west of where Ponce sits today. He was the first to lead a revolt against the Spanish conquistadors in 1511 in the Battle of Yaguecas. And he died in that battle, but inspired the Taino to rebel against the Spanish for another 8 years. Not someone to mess with. So now we're going to move to the defense. And our defenders need to be intelligent, quick, and willing to do some of the dirty work out there. So our first defender is the great citizen of the Americas, none other than Eugenio María de Hostos, who was from Mayagüez. Hostos was an intellectual, a philosopher, an educator and lawyer in the 19th century, and traveled throughout Latin America. He advocated for the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain and to form a confederation between those people and the Dominican Republic. He called it the Antillean Confederation. That was his idea. He also developed education systems in Peru, Chile, and the Dominican Republic. And he spent his final days in the DR and specified that his remains be kept in Santo Domingo until Puerto Rico was an independent nation. And at that point, they could be laid to rest back in Maya West. Very important person. Next in defense is a literary giant. That person is the poet, none other than Julia de Burgos. Julia was from Carolina, my hometown, and was the oldest of 13 children from a poor family. Now, for much of her short life, de Burgos championed Puerto Rican nationalism and identity through her writing, and her work explored issues of love, the island's colonial past, and the legacy of slavery in Puerto Rico. And she died tragically young at the age of 39 in New York City. But she was a great writer and known throughout, and an inspiration for many other Latin American women writers. Now, one thing about her name, she was born as Julia Burgos Garcia. And in that era, it was traditional for women to change their maternal last name to that of their husband, along with the word de, meaning of, like I am of this person. She was married at 20, and when she was divorced at 23, when she divorced her first husband, she changed her name back, not to her original surnames, but she added de in front of Burgos, meaning that I belong to myself and no one else. Pretty bold move for a woman of that age. That's Julia de Burgos. Our last defender is known as the father of modern Puerto Rico, otherwise known as Luis Muñoz Marin. Muñoz Marin was born in Old San Juan to the son of a famous politician, Luis Muñoz Rivera. And I mentioned before that Muñoz Marin was the first freely elected governor of Puerto Rico. He was elected in 1948 and was the architect of the political arrangement that is the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. He introduced a number of economic, political, and social reforms in the 1940s and 50s to improve the lives of ordinary Puerto Ricans, to lift them from extreme poverty. And he encouraged a great deal of industrialization and development to the territory. The main international airport in Carolina is named after him. So those are our defenders. Let's move to the midfielders. And our midfielders are athletic with strong fundamentals and abilities to instill terror in opposing defenses. Our first is the teacher, otherwise known as Pedro Albizu Campos. Albizu Campos was from Ponce and was a lawyer and activist who advocated for Puerto Rican independence as the leader of the Nationalist Party, starting in the 1930s until his death in 1965. He graduated from Harvard and Harvard Law and spoke 6 languages, plus spoke classical Greek and Latin. And he successfully organized the Puerto Rican sugarcane workers to a strike in 1934 that ended with the workers doubling their pay, but landed Albizu Campos in the crosshairs of powerful business and political interests for the rest of his life. Now, he was a controversial figure and was imprisoned by both the US federal and the local Puerto Rican governments. But he was a gifted orator who inspired many for the cause of independence, and you simply must know who this figure was. Our next person is none other than the Great One. He was also known by Arriba and the Carolina Comet. He is Roberto Clemente Walker, who was from Carolina. Roberto is one of the greatest baseball players ever to play the game. He could hit for average and power, run, field, and had a cannon of a right arm in right field. Played for the Pittsburgh Pirates from 1955 and 1972 and was the first Latin American player to be voted into Cooperstown. And you can go on and read about all of his accomplishments. But despite his fame, he always remained humble and was an even greater humanitarian who dedicated his time away from baseball through charity work in Pittsburgh, in Puerto Rico, and in other parts of Latin America. And it's that charity work that led to his untimely death, when the relief flight that he organized for the victims of the 1972 Nicaragua earthquake crashed shortly after takeoff from Carolina on New Year's Eve of 1972. And our last midfielder is known as the father of the statehood movement. That person is known as Dr. Jose Celso Barbosa. He was from Bayamón. And as a late teenager, Dr. Barbosa moved to New York City to learn English after graduating from high school in Puerto Rico. He learned English in 1 year. And while in New York City, he was originally planning to become a lawyer, but he caught pneumonia and his doctor recommended he switch to medicine. Now, despite his strong credentials, he was denied admission to Colombia solely because of the color of his skin, as he is Afro-Boricua. And Colombia actually told him this straight up in his rejection letter. But the University of Michigan gladly accepts him, and he graduates first in his class. Go Blue. He goes back to Puerto Rico to practice medicine, and he practices all over the island and was the first to introduce an early employer-based medical insurance system in the archipelago. And he also founded the first banking cooperative on the island, kind of like a credit union. Now, he eventually enters into politics, advocating for autonomy from Spain. And then after the Spanish-American War, he organizes the first statehood party of Puerto Rico and serves in various executive cabinets for the early governors of Puerto Rico, and also serves in the Puerto Rican Senate. That's Dr. Jose Celso Barbosa. And now let's move to our attacking line. Now, the 7 people that we've illustrated here are all well-known figures in Puerto Rico. Our first attacker, however, is not, and that is a crime. She is known as the mother of women's sports in Puerto Rico, and her name is Dr. Rebecca Kohlberg Cabrera. She was from Cabo Rojo. She was a pioneer who fought for the rights of women to participate in sports in an era where fathers would not allow their daughters to play, which would have been in the 1930s. But she persisted and eventually won the right to compete and was incredibly talented. She won gold medals in the javelin and discus at the 1938 Central American and Caribbean Games in Panama, and then won another gold in softball at the 1946 Games in Barranquilla, Colombia. She was a 14-time national tennis champion in Puerto Rico. So she was a multi-sport athlete before anybody understood the benefits of being a multi-sport athlete. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Puerto Rico at Rio Piedras, and she earned a master's in physical education from Columbia University in New York. And then she earned her medical degree at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the UNAM, and became a pediatric psychiatrist in Puerto Rico. Truly an extraordinary pioneer. Our next attacker is known as Lola, whose full name was Dolores Rodriguez de Tio. She was from San Germán in the Southwest, and like Julia de Burgos, Lola was a poet. Now, she was the first female poet to gain international reputation in Latin America in the 19th century. She was a women's rights activist, an abolitionist, and an independent activist. She was also a bit of a badass because she insisted on cutting her hair short during a time where women were expected to wear it long. She also wrote the original lyrics of our national anthem, La Borinqueña, which encouraged revolution from Spain. And you see that in the lyrics. And after the Lattice Uprising, she and her husband were banished from Puerto Rico, spent some time in New York City, and then eventually settled in Cuba, where she's buried, and well known to this day. And then our last person is our team captain. This person is known as the father of our nation. His name is Dr. Ramon Emeterio Betances, and he was originally from Cabo Rojo. Betances was a medical doctor and surgeon and independence advocate in the mid-19th century when Puerto Rico was under Spanish control. He was a successful physician in Puerto Rico and ran a free clinic to treat the poor. Dr. Betances was also an abolitionist, as slavery was still fully available on the island. and starting in the early 1860s, began to write numerous proclamations designed to generate a sense of Puerto Rican identity and nationalism. And he was the chief organizer and instigator of the Lares Uprising in 1868. And after being forced into exile, he became a diplomat in France on behalf of the Dominican Republic and other Latin American nations, but continued to advocate for Puerto Rican independence until his death in 1898, just a few days after the US invasion. So that's our starting lineup of Puerto Ricans you must know. All right, we're going to just talk about our symbols and how they're important to us. My uncle sent me this photo that one of his friends took. My uncle lives in Palmas del Mar, which is a residential community outside of Humacao. And that island here that you can barely see in the background, just on the horizon, that's Vieques, which you can see. So let's just start with our flags. Our original flag is that Lares flag of 1868, and Lares has now adopted this as its municipal flag. The original variant of our current flag appeared in 1895 with its sky blue color and was designed as a complement to the Cuban flag with the red and blue colors reversed from the Cuban flag. And the current flag became official in 1952 when Puerto Rico became a Commonwealth. And we sometimes refer to it as La Monoestrellada, or the Lone Star flag. Now the shade of blue isn't specified. Royal blue is traditional, but I'm seeing more people show the original sky blue, which is my preferred color, and the one that you can see in the background here in my office. Governor Muñoz Marin chose navy blue to be more in alignment with the US flag, but I don't think that one is quite as popular. And in fact, I'm starting to see the Lares flag grow in popularity with younger people, like on social media. Now, there's one thing I want to share with you about our flag that has to do with its orientation so that you don't inadvertently fly it upside or hold it upside down. Pay attention to the star. If you have one point like you see here, it's correct. But if you have 2 points on top, it's upside down. So when you're taking pictures, at your tournaments and your events and holding the flag, make sure that the star is oriented in the right position. Now, one quick fact about the Puerto Rican flag's history is that in June 1948, the Puerto Rican legislature passed Law 53. This was known as La Ley de Mordaza, or the gag law. And this law was designed to suppress and punish members of the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico who were pushing for independence. The law made it a crime to sing patriotic songs about Puerto Rico, or to speak or write about independence, or to assemble and hold meetings about independence, and display and own the Puerto Rican flag, even in your own home, like what you see in my office. The law allowed the police to come search your home without a warrant and seize all property, even without probable cause. And the crime was punishable by 10 years in prison, a fine of $10,000, which in today's dollars, that's the equivalent of nearly $120,000, or both. That law was in place for 9 years until 1957. When it was found to be unconstitutional because such activities were protected by the free speech clause in both the Puerto Rican Constitution of 1952 and the free speech clause of the US Constitution. So now I hope you can understand why the flag is a very important symbol of pride for us, because it has a history where people, that right for us to hold it was taken away from us. Really quickly, our anthem is called La Borinqueña. That it's based on a 19th century tune in the style of a danza, which was a style of a ballroom dance in Puerto Rico at the time. And there are actually two sets of lyrics: the original revolutionary lyrics from Lola Rodriguez de Tio in 1868, and then the official lyrics that were, I'll say, more neutral, that were written in 1903 by Manuel Fernandez Juncos. I won't play the theme here. There'll be links later on where you can listen to the tune. But the expectation will be for those who represent us at our official tournaments to know the lyrics. As when you go to these tournaments, most of the country's players sing the lyrics while their national anthems are being played at the beginning of each match. So you do not want to be that person with the cameras on them and who's not singing along the lyrics. So know them. All right, this is my last slide before we get to the references. I took this photo in 2018, which comes from a very old debate poster that I came across while I was visiting my alma mater, Bates College. And I was there because we were visiting my older daughter, Caroline, who was a student there and was acting in a theater production. And we're waiting in the lobby of one of the academic building that holds the theater. It's called Pettigrew Hall. And we're standing by the trophy cabinet of the debate team, which has a long tradition at Bates. And I noticed this poster, which I never noticed before when I was a student. It dates back from April 1928, nearly 100 years ago, when the Bates team was hosting a team from the University of Puerto Rico. Now, because of the orientation of my original slide, the top gets cut off, but what the title says of the poster says, "Shall we keep the Marines in Nicaragua?" Now, pay attention to the spelling of our nation. You can see that it's Puerto Rico with an O, not Puerto Rico or Puerto Rico. So from 1899, when the Treaty of Paris was signed that gave control of Puerto Rico to the US until May 1932, this was the official name of the territory by the US. And it took an act of Congress that was spearheaded by the Puerto Rican resident commissioner, he was the non-voting representative to Congress, Felix Cordova Davila, where he introduced a bill, HJ Resolution 149, to change the name back to the original Spanish version. But the pronunciation still remains in common parlance. And I want to remind people that it is Puerto Rico or Puerto Rico, not Puerto Rico. And as you can tell, I'm not shy about using the Spanish pronunciation, even when I'm speaking English. And so you shouldn't either. All right, just quickly, my references here. I'm just going to take a moment to drop them into the chat, and then we can go through them. Okay. Okay, there they all are. Perfect. All right, one by one. I start with The War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Denis. This is a very difficult book to read. And the difficulty has nothing to do with like the reading level. You know, it's not a graduate level text per se. It's difficult because the content material is very traumatic. When you learn about the history of 20th century Puerto Rico and the events that took place, many of which we don't really talk about and or have faded from public view with time. And there's so much that I learned that I simply did not know before reading this book. You know, I thought I knew a lot about Puerto Rico. There was so much I did not know that this book revealed to me, like who Pedro Albizu Campos was, the Ponce Massacre of 1937, the 1950 uprising, and more. Now, granted, the author does have a point of view. There is, I don't want to say moral, but, you know, history books can sometimes be advocating for a particular position. And I think it's kind of clear what this book is advocating for, but it is incredibly well researched and there are gobs of references and notes. Though I will say that my mother has some minor quibbles with some of the Spanish language editing. She's made it very clear to me. And I think she's even probably written to the editor. But this should be required reading for every Puerto Rican. Next is Bianca Graulau. She is a Puerto Rican independent journalist who's covering all kinds of unique and interesting stories in Puerto Rico via social media. You can follow her along on Instagram. She's got a YouTube channel where she has some of her longer segments. You can also follow her on the TikTok. And yes, I call it the TikTok. She grew up in Hatillo, which is on the northwest coast of Puerto Rico, but she got her bachelor's degree at Syracuse in their highly regarded journalism school. And she worked as a TV reporter in Sacramento, California, first starting out with the Spanish language Univision affiliate, and then she crossed over to the English language ABC affiliate. She does most of her reporting on social media in English, and that's intentional because of her strategy. That's the audience she's trying to reach. She's trying to educate English-speaking audiences about what's going on in Puerto Rico. So go follow her if you're not already. For those of you who want to know where to get a Puerto Rican flag, go to banderasboricuas.com. They are a Puerto Rican-based company. They're based out of San Juan. Go support our people. They have an extensive library of flags, from our national flag, both the sky and the royal variants, to alternative variants of the flag, like the one that's in all black. They have various historical flags. They have the municipal flags for each of the towns, which are really cool. I get no benefit from promoting them, so just full disclosure, I just think that they're great, and that's where I ordered my flags. Now, pro tip, I would get, if you have a choice between the nylon and the polyester ones, I think the nylon flags, like the one I have back here, they're much nicer. They're a little bit more expensive. They're just much more heavier duty. The polyester ones are a little bit, they're kind of flimsy. They're really more for indoor use. Now, the site is in Spanish, but you shouldn't have too much trouble ordering, to navigating. And if you get confused or you're just a little bit intimidated, reach out to me and I can help you out. In San Juan, the next point here, there is a monument behind the Capitol building, and it's titled the Plaza in honor of the Puerto Rican women. This was inaugurated in 2014 with the first class of 12 women. 3 of the women in that inaugural class were mentioned in my fictitious starting 10 lineup. Julia de Burgos, Lola, and Dr. Kohlberg. And I've also attached one of the few videos about Dr. Kohlberg. There isn't a lot of information about her, but this is a nice sort of segment, about I think 6 minutes, and it has interviews of people who knew her. And there's even a very brief segment of her actually when she's much older, and she's talking a little bit about her experience. That one's all in Spanish. I also have links to our national anthem as well. And then lastly, I found on Reddit a post from someone who provided more recent instructions about how to get that Puerto Rican citizenship certificate. The biggest issue, like the application form is easy to complete. It's easy to kind of collect the documents that you need. The trickiest thing is how you get the internal revenue stamps that the government uses to sort of process their application and actually put the official seal. But this person explains how to get them. You have to do it through online. It's a little bit of a process. Those instructions, the step-by-step instructions are in Spanish, but the most of that thread is in English. So again, if you need some help, I'm really curious, because if some of you decide to get this, I want to know how you make out, because I have mine, but I want to get them for my 2 daughters as well. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a quote from Dr. Betances. So the love of one's homeland is nourished by respecting what is ours. And now that you know what is ours in terms of our history, our land, our people, our symbols, you can understand and respect them. And when you do, your love for Puerto Rico will only grow. This statue is of Dr. Betances. It's in the Puerto Rican Athenaeum in Old San Juan. Y ya tú sabes. Now you know. So let's open it up for questions.
Ismail, thank you. I think it's an awesome opportunity to realize that I think being a part of this organization and doing something that's unique, like bringing lacrosse to Puerto Rico, we all have the opportunity to become one of those 10 people that you mentioned in Puerto Rican history and change our island and really influence the youth of Puerto Rico through the game of lacrosse. One question I had, and it's kind of, you kind of tied it up towards the end there. How would you phrase it, or what would you tell our audience? Why is it important that, us as the diaspora of Puerto Ricans know about these historical figures and know about our history and know about our people? What would you say best would answer that?
Well, I think it's part of, understanding, establishing your connections, to your culture and heritage, those themes that we talked during it last week. And I think it's also a way to not only foster, it's like what Dr. Patanza says, is it's how you can foster your love for Puerto Rico, to feel that pride and to know that about your cultural history and can appreciate it and demonstrate it, to others, especially those on the island who, there is that conflict, right? There's that sense of trying to prove to ourselves and maybe to others that we are Puerto Rican enough, and you are. And by knowing your history, you can put those doubters and those naysayers to rest, because you know your history. That's how I would explain it.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. And I would also, second what Ismail said. If you get a chance, please read that book by Nelson Denis, War Against All Puerto Ricans. I'm about 3/4 of the way done with it, but I know every time I read a chapter and I learn something new about our history and what our people went through in Puerto Rico, this sort of anger wells up within me, and I use it as motivation to do what we do with Puerto Rico Lacrosse, to do exactly what Ismail said and prove everybody wrong that we are strong people, we are independent, and we can accomplish a lot of great things as Puerto Ricans. So I would definitely recommend that everyone read that book. Natalie, I know I cut you off last time, but do you want to add anything, or because I can give you this opportunity since I cut you off at the last meeting?
Sure. I third that recommendation. Ismail gave it to me before, and I'll tap into kind of what he said. I started reading the actual book, and then it got really hard for me to keep working through. So I downloaded the audiobook, which feels better because I feel like I'm not personalizing what I'm hearing. So if you guys also have that option too, download the audiobook and I don't know, I walk and listen to it. But I think from growing up here on the US, on the state side, what I love about what we're doing is that you're finding new ways to connect with a history that I never personally learned in school. And I think once you start to learn and dive into it, we kind of owe it not only to ourselves, but to future generations of kids and athletes and, and our future kids, to give them our history, something to be proud of. There's so much good stuff in that book too. It's not all horrible. It's oh my gosh, I didn't realize, we had the sugar canes, we had coffee beans, we had tobacco. There's so much good stuff to realize how resourceful our people were. We're a lot of good to be taken from that, and that can carry with you throughout your life. But I think from an athlete perspective, really tapping into part of who we are. And I think it helps you perform better when you feel stronger connection to our struggles. That's all I got. Great job, Ismail. I absolutely loved it.
Thank you, Nat. And I see Sophia put in the chat, also speak to my family and ask for their stories and their experiences. I know as I got older, my Spanish got better, so I got to communicate with my grandmother a little bit on a deeper level, to hear about her struggles coming from Puerto Rico to the US. And I think in the book, it mentions it too, that how our women were being sterilized in the masses without being told. And my grandmother was actually going to be one of those people who were sterilized, but they found that she was pregnant with one of my aunts. And it's horrifying stories like that you hear that we have no idea happened unless you speak about it. So it's really important to understand our history, what our people went through, and our mission as a family within Puerto Rico Lacrosse is to make a difference Just like Ismail was mentioning, if we equip ourselves with these tools, we'll be better suited to accomplish our mission. And that's to change Puerto Rico and give the kids in the island and give our people a fresh new opportunity to be good at something that we're not generally known to be good at on a grander scale. Because I know our teams always do extremely well in the tournament. So we're looking forward to that as well. But make sure you're talking to your families and really learning about your history. Any other questions? Anybody want to add anything before we end this evening? All right, I think we're good. Everybody, thank you for joining. We're going to send another invite for our third installment. I just want to give a round of applause to Ismail for doing an incredible job. Thank you, Ismail. Our next meeting should be, or our next gathering will be probably in a month or soon, but just keep an eye out, and we're excited for the next installment. So thank you guys for coming out tonight, and we'll see everybody soon.